My mother-in-law's cruel speech revealed my wife's true intentions, but what I did next turned their manipulation into my greatest victory. At 32, I thought I understood love. I thought I knew what loyalty meant. But when my mother-in-law stood up at our wedding reception and declared that this poor boy thinks he can provide for my daughter, she's just using him until someone better comes along, and my bride laughed along with her cruel words, I discovered how profoundly wrong I could be about the people closest to me. What happened when they arrived at my house weeks later would teach them a lesson about underestimating someone they thought they had completely figured out. My buddy Christopher keeps insisting I need to document this whole experience before I move forward with my life, as he puts it. I'm not naturally a storyteller, but there's something cathartic about getting this out there. Maybe it'll help someone else recognize the warning signs I chose to ignore for far too long. I met Sarah at my cousin's celebration 3 years ago. She was there with a mutual friend, and honestly, she was completely out of my league. The kind of woman who commands attention the moment she enters a room, with this effortless grace that made every other person fade into the background. We connected over some streaming series we were both watching, can't even recall which one now, and exchanged social media contacts. I figured she was just being polite and wouldn't respond when I messaged her later, but she surprised me. Our first date was refreshingly simple. Just coffee at that popular downtown spot everyone frequents for their artistic latte designs. I was nervous as hell, but Sarah seemed genuinely interested in me. She asked thoughtful questions about my family, my interests, my dreams for the future. She told me she worked at a dental practice and lived with a roommate in one of those modern apartment complexes on the east side. The conversation flowed naturally, and for the first time in years, I felt like someone truly saw me. Things progressed remarkably quickly after that. Within 6 months, we were practically living together at my place, a modest two-bedroom I'd been renting for several years. She'd stay over 5 nights a week, had her belongings scattered throughout my space, but maintained her apartment because the lease wasn't finished. That should have been my first warning sign, the way she kept one foot perpetually out the door. She never invited me to her place, always had some elaborate excuse about her roommate being uncomfortable with guests or ongoing maintenance issues. The first time I met her mother, Patricia, was about 8 months into our relationship. Sarah had been strangely evasive about introducing me to her family, but finally arranged a dinner at some upscale restaurant where the appetizers cost more than I typically spend on an entire week's groceries. The moment Patricia's eyes met mine, I felt like a specimen being examined under a microscope. She peppered me with pointed questions about my career trajectory, my financial plans, my long-term goals, all while glancing dismissively at my everyday Casio watch, nothing extravagant, just functional. When Sarah excused herself to the restroom, Patricia leaned across the linen-covered table and delivered her assessment with surgical precision. She informed me that her daughter was accustomed to a certain standard of living that would be challenging for someone in my position to maintain. I laughed it off, assuming she was making some awkward attempt at humor, but her expression remained deadly serious. When Sarah returned, the conversation smoothly shifted to their recent family vacation to Cancun, complete with detailed descriptions of their oceanfront suite and private dining experiences. Later that evening, I mentioned to Sarah that her mother seemed rather intense. She simply shrugged and explained that Patricia was protective because Sarah's father had abandoned them with essentially nothing when she was 12. The explanation made sense, so I didn't pursue it further. Looking back, I realized I was already beginning to make excuses for behavior that should have raised every red flag imaginable. Fast forward another year, and I proposed. Nothing extravagant or over the top, just a heartfelt moment at the lake where we'd shared our third date. I got down on one knee with a ring I'd saved for months to purchase, something beautiful but within my means. Sarah seemed genuinely moved, immediately taking dozens of photos to share on her social media, and her first call wasn't to her closest friends, it was to her mother. Right there at the lake, while we were still caught up in the magic of the moment. That's when everything started shifting into something unrecognizable. Wedding planning transformed Sarah into someone I barely recognized. Suddenly, everything had to be premium quality, top-tier venues that were typically booked 18 months in advance. Mysteriously, she secured us a spot with only 4 months' notice. Florists who usually handled celebrity events in the city were somehow available for our celebration. Every time I brought up budget concerns, Sarah would dismiss my worries by saying her mother was handling most of the financial arrangements, so I shouldn't stress about the details. But when deposit time arrived, guess whose credit card was charged every single time? Mine. When I'd ask about Patricia's contributions, Sarah would get this wounded expression, like I just insulted her entire lineage, and say something like, "Mom's coordinating everything. That's her contribution." Or, "She'll reimburse us after the wedding." She never did. My savings account was systematically drained. Then my emergency fund disappeared. I even dipped into my land fund, money I'd been quietly setting aside for years to eventually purchase property outside the city limits. I never mentioned that particular account to Sarah. That detail would prove crucial later. The wedding day arrived, and despite my growing financial anxiety, I was genuinely excited. Sarah looked absolutely radiant in her dress. The venue was admittedly spectacular, and even my socially awkward brother managed to deliver his best man speech without any major disasters. The evening was unfolding beautifully until it was time for the parental toasts. My mother spoke first, sharing some touching words about love and partnership that brought tears to my eyes. Then Patricia rose with her champagne glass, and I swear the temperature in the room plummeted. She began by expressing how surprised she'd been when Sarah first brought me home, describing me as unconventional compared to Sarah's previous boyfriends. She mentioned how Sarah had always been drawn to ambitious men, the implication hanging heavily in the air that I didn't qualify. The guests were growing visibly uncomfortable, people exchanging those awkward glances across tables. Then Patricia delivered the line that's been replaying in my mind for months. "This poor boy thinks he can provide for my daughter. Please, she's just using him until someone better comes along." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Sarah laughed. Not a nervous, embarrassed laugh, but a genuine, delighted laugh, like her mother had just shared the most amusing inside joke. I looked at Sarah, waiting for her to say something, anything, to defend me or our relationship. But she just kept smiling at her mother with this look of shared understanding, like they were the only two people in on some elaborate secret. My father started to rise from his chair. He's old school and doesn't tolerate disrespect, but my mother gently pulled him back down. I just sat there, my smile frozen in place, as Patricia concluded with some backhanded comment about enjoying the ride while it lasted before taking her seat. The DJ, bless his professional instincts, immediately increased the music volume and announced it was time for our first dance. Sarah grabbed my hand like nothing had happened and pulled me to the dance floor. I was in complete shock, moving through the motions of our choreographed dance while my brain struggled to process what had just occurred. Sarah kept whispering about how perfect everything was, how happy she felt, while I nodded like some kind of bobblehead doll. Later that night, back in our hotel room, I finally gathered the courage to address what had happened. I asked Sarah what her mother meant by that toast. She rolled her eyes and accused me of being overly sensitive, claiming her mother just had an unusual sense of humor that didn't always translate well. When I pressed her about why she'd laughed, she became irritated and said she was merely trying to smooth over an awkward moment. I let it drop because it was our wedding night, and I didn't want to begin our marriage with conflict. But something fundamental had shifted inside me, a seed of doubt that hadn't existed before, or perhaps it had been there all along, and I'd been desperately ignoring it. The honeymoon in Puerto Vallarta felt strange and disconnected. Sarah was all affection and enthusiasm when we were taking photos for her social media, but distant and preoccupied when we were alone together. She was constantly checking her phone, and when I asked who she was communicating with so frequently, she'd become defensive and accused me of being controlling. We returned home and attempted to settle into married life, but that small seed of doubt kept growing, sending roots deeper into my consciousness. Sarah immediately started discussing purchasing a house in one of those exclusive gated communities on the north side where doctors and lawyers resided. When I pointed out that we couldn't realistically afford anything in those neighborhoods, she casually mentioned that her mother would assist with the down payment. Same story, different day, the promises of financial support that never materialized when the bills arrived. About 3 weeks after our wedding, I came home early due to a water main break at the construction site. Sarah didn't hear me enter because she was on the phone in our bedroom, her voice carrying through the closed door. I wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but when I heard my name mentioned, I froze in the hallway. She was talking to her mother, laughing about how Marcus has no idea, and something about Jacob says the market is perfect right now, and establishing residency first so the prenup doesn't matter. Jacob, her ex-boyfriend, the one she dated before me, who worked in real estate. The one Patricia constantly brought up as an example of Sarah's usual type, the kind of man she typically attracted. I quietly backed down the hallway, went outside, and then re-entered making plenty of noise. When Sarah emerged from the bedroom, her phone was nowhere to be seen, and she looked flustered, like someone who'd been caught in the middle of something she couldn't explain. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay there replaying that conversation in my mind, connecting it to Patricia's wedding toast, to all the strange little moments that had never quite made sense. While Sarah slept peacefully beside me, I used her thumb to unlock her phone. She'd never changed her passcode after catching me looking through mine months earlier. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Text messages with her mother discussing the plan. Messages with Jacob that were far too intimate for someone who was supposedly just an ex-boyfriend. Screenshots of my credit report that she'd somehow obtained without my knowledge. Research on divorce laws in our state regarding asset division and property rights. They were playing me, had been from the very beginning. The scheme was apparently to use my steady income and decent credit score to secure a mortgage on an expensive house, establish legal residency, then divorce me for Jacob once some prenuptial timeline expired. In our state, the person who remains in the house during separation proceedings usually gets to keep it in the divorce settlement, especially if the other party can't afford to buy them out. I wanted to wake her up immediately and confront her with everything I'd discovered, but something held me back. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the sudden, devastating realization that I'd been sharing my life with a complete stranger for 3 years. Whatever it was, I decided in that moment to play a longer game, to see this through strategically rather than emotionally. What Sarah and Patricia didn't know was that I wasn't as financially naive as they believed. Yes, I'd spent my visible savings on our wedding, but that land fund I'd mentioned to myself over the years was actually much more substantial than a simple savings account. I'd already purchased 5 acres outside the city limits 3 years before I even met Sarah. Paid in full, deed in my name exclusively. I'd been saving to build on it eventually, but never mentioned it to her because, well, some part of me had always sensed she wasn't as invested in our shared future as I was. The next morning, I acted completely normal, kissed Sarah goodbye as she left for work, then called in sick for the first time in 2 years. I spent the day making strategic phone calls, first to a lawyer to understand my legal options, then to my buddy who runs a construction crew, and finally to my bank to secure my accounts and assets. For the next few weeks, I played the role of the perfect, oblivious husband. I agreed enthusiastically when Sarah suggested we start house hunting. I nodded along when she showed me listings way above our realistic price range. I pretended to believe her when she assured me that her mother would provide financial assistance. Meanwhile, I was methodically setting a plan in motion that would give Sarah and Patricia exactly what they deserved, the surprise of their lives. I pulled my construction crew together, guys I'd worked with for years who I trusted completely. I told them I had a personal project and needed their help during evenings and weekends. Everyone was immediately on board. Even my boss, who'd been like a father figure to me since I started working for him at 19, offered to help with materials and equipment at cost. For the next 3 weeks, I lived a carefully constructed double life. During the day, I was the clueless husband, even starting to go along with Sarah's increasingly bold hints about house hunting. Yeah, babe, that neighborhood sounds perfect. Sure, I can ask about overtime to boost our down payment savings. Of course your mom has excellent taste in kitchen countertops. Evenings and weekends, though, I was building what my crew started calling the Spite House. We worked with the intensity of people on a mission, getting the framing completed in record time. Plumbing, electrical, heating, and cooling systems, all installed by skilled professionals who owed me favors or were friends willing to help for beer and barbecue. I called in every connection I had for materials, some leftover from other projects, some at contractor pricing, some outright donated when people heard vague details of my situation. The whole time, Sarah was getting increasingly bold with her planning. She started casually mentioning that her mother had a friend in real estate, though she never used Jacob's name directly to me. She began leaving mortgage calculators open on her laptop where I'd conveniently see them. She even started discussing which of our current furniture would look good in a bigger, more upscale place. One evening, she left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. A text from Patricia appeared that simply read, "Jacob found the perfect one. Showing tomorrow." I photographed her screen, then carefully placed the phone back exactly where it had been, adding the image to my growing collection of evidence. The next day at work, my boss pulled me aside. He'd been helping coordinate material deliveries to my land and knew most of what was happening. He asked if I was holding up okay, and something about the genuine concern in his voice nearly broke through the emotional armor I'd built around myself. I'd been running on pure determination and suppressed anger for so long that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone genuinely care about my well-being. I admitted I wasn't okay. Not really, but I would be. I just needed to finish what I'd started, to see this through to its conclusion. That weekend was when everything came to a head. Sarah announced that her mother had discovered the perfect starter home for us and wanted to take us to see it on Sunday. I readily agreed, then casually mentioned I had a surprise for her too, something I'd been working on for weeks. Sarah's face did this interesting thing where she tried to look excited but was clearly suspicious underneath. She asked what kind of surprise I had planned. I just smiled and said it was something significant, something I thought would really demonstrate how much our future together meant to me. The expression that crossed her face, a mixture of triumph and barely concealed satisfaction, told me everything I needed to know. She thought I was talking about agreeing to the house her mother had selected, that I was finally falling in line with their elaborate plan. I suggested we make a complete day of it Sunday, see her mother's house selection in the morning, then I'd show her my surprise in the afternoon. She immediately agreed, already texting her mother about the schedule adjustment. That night, I lay in bed next to a woman I now realized had never truly loved me and felt strangely calm and resolved. The spite house was nearly complete. My lawyer had all the documentation he needed, and I'd discreetly moved my important papers and family heirlooms to my parents' house over the past few weeks. Everything was perfectly positioned. Sunday morning, Sarah spent an extraordinary amount of time getting ready, like she was preparing for a magazine photo shoot rather than a simple house viewing. We drove separately to meet Patricia, with Sarah saying she might go shopping with her mother afterward. Perfect, I thought. The house Patricia showed us was exactly what I'd expected, way beyond our actual budget in a pretentious neighborhood full of identical oversized houses on lots so small you could hear your neighbors' conversations. The place had 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, granite everything, situated on property barely large enough for the structure itself. Jacob was there too, dressed like he was auditioning for a real estate television show, all perfect teeth and firm handshakes. I played along beautifully, asking all the appropriate questions about mortgage rates, property taxes, neighborhood amenities. Patricia kept making little comments like, "Don't worry about the financial details, we'll make everything work," while Sarah gushed over the walk-in closets and soaking tub like she'd discovered buried treasure. After an hour of this carefully orchestrated performance, I checked my watch and mentioned it was time to head to my surprise. Sarah tried to postpone, claiming she was tired from all the house excitement, but I insisted. "This is really important to me," I said. "I've been working on this for weeks, putting my heart into it." Something in my tone must have conveyed the significance, because she reluctantly agreed. I suggested Patricia come along too, and Jacob as well if he was interested. The more witnesses, the better for what I had planned. They all exchanged curious glances, but eventually agreed to follow me in their cars. I led our little convoy out of the fancy suburb, through town, and toward the rural area where my land was located. In my rearview mirror, I could see Sarah's face growing increasingly confused the further we traveled from civilization. When we finally turned onto the gravel road leading to my property, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: sadness for what could have been, anger at how I'd been deceived, but mostly anticipation for what was about to unfold. As we crested the small hill and the spite house came into full view, I heard car tires skid on gravel behind me as Sarah slammed on her brakes. I pulled up to my creation and parked calmly, then got out and waited as Sarah, Patricia, and Jacob slowly approached, their faces displaying absolute shock and confusion. It wasn't at all what they were expecting. It wasn't what anyone would expect. The house I'd built was intentionally, aggressively yellow. Not a pleasant, subtle yellow, but the most obnoxious, eye-searing shade of yellow paint available at the hardware store. It looked like a giant traffic cone had been transformed into residential architecture. The design was functional but deliberately bizarre, with windows placed asymmetrically, and a front door painted bright orange for maximum visual assault. "Welcome to my surprise," I announced cheerfully. "This is what I've been working on. My new home." The silence was profound. Sarah's mouth was hanging open like she was trying to catch flies. Patricia's face had turned an interesting shade of red. Not embarrassed red, more like apoplectic red. Jacob looked like he was reconsidering every life choice that had led him to this moment. "You built this?" Sarah finally managed to stammer. "Every square inch," I replied proudly. "Bought this land 3 years before I met you, paid in full. Been planning and saving for years. The house is completely finished, fully permitted, ready for occupancy. And it's all mine." That's when Patricia found her voice, and it wasn't pleasant. She started ranting about how I was clearly unstable, how this ridiculous structure proved I had no sense of taste or judgment, how I'd obviously wasted money that should have gone toward a proper home for her daughter. She actually threatened legal action, which made me laugh out loud. I gently reminded her that in our state, with such a brief marriage, no children, and with all the evidence I had gathered of their deception, Sarah would be fortunate if a judge didn't order her to pay me compensation for fraud and emotional distress. That was mostly empty bluster, but they didn't know that. Sarah tried a different approach, switching from shock to tears in about 2 seconds flat. She started sobbing about how I was misunderstanding everything, how she loved me, how she'd never intentionally hurt me. Meanwhile, Patricia was talking over her, demanding to know how I discovered their plans, threatening to make me regret treating her daughter this way. I let them exhaust themselves with their performances, partly because it was fascinating to watch their masks come off completely, and partly because my phone was quietly recording everything. My lawyer had suggested capturing their true personalities on video if possible. Mission accomplished. When they finally ran out of steam, I explained calmly that I wanted a divorce, that I'd already consulted with a lawyer who was preparing the paperwork, that Sarah could keep her engagement ring and whatever personal belongings she brought into the marriage, but everything else stayed with its rightful owner. Sarah's face went through this transformation where it started to crumple, then hardened when she realized the tears weren't working. That's when she got truly nasty, saying things about how I was never good enough for her anyway, how Jacob earned 3 times my salary and wouldn't live in what she called a clown house, how she'd been faking satisfaction in our intimate life because I couldn't please her properly. You know those moments in movies where the insults are supposed to cut deep and devastate the hero? This wasn't one of those moments. Honestly, I just felt relieved. Every cruel word out of her mouth confirmed I was making the right decision. Patricia joined in, naturally, saying I'd trapped her daughter with my pathetic fantasies of building a life together, that I was jealous of people with real money and class, that no woman with options would choose someone like me. I let them continue for a while, getting it all out of their systems and onto my recording. When they finally exhausted their repertoire of insults, I simply shrugged and said it was time to go. Sarah demanded to know if I was really going to force her to live in that monstrosity until our divorce was finalized. I told her no, she could return to our apartment, which was in my name, pack her belongings, and be out by the following day. She could stay with her mother, or Jacob, or whoever else wanted to deal with her drama. That triggered another round of shouting, with Sarah insisting she had legal rights to the apartment and Patricia threatening more legal action. I reminded them that without children, with such a brief marriage, and with all the evidence I'd collected, Sarah would be lucky if she didn't end up owing me money when everything was settled. The drive back to the apartment was the most awkward 30 minutes of my life. Sarah maintained stony silence in the passenger seat while Patricia kept trying to make phone calls from the back, probably to that lawyer they'd been threatening me with, but couldn't get signal once we left the main road. When we arrived, Sarah stormed into the bedroom and slammed the door. Patricia informed me this wasn't over, that they'd make me regret treating her daughter this way. I just nodded and suggested she should probably help Sarah pack. I spent the rest of the day on the couch, scrolling through my phone and occasionally answering texts from Christopher asking how the big revelation had gone. I could hear Sarah and Patricia in the bedroom, alternating between angry whispers and the sounds of belongings being thrown into suitcases. Around dinner time, Sarah emerged with red, puffy eyes and asked if we could talk privately. Patricia looked like she wanted to object, but Sarah gave her a look, and she reluctantly went to wait in the car. Once we were alone, Sarah sat beside me on the couch, closer than necessary, and put on her sweetest voice, the one she used to use when she wanted something expensive. She asked if I was really certain about the divorce, suggested maybe we'd rushed into marriage without truly knowing each other, said she was willing to try counseling if I was open to it. For a split second, and I'm not proud of this, I wavered. Not because I believed her, but because it's difficult to simply turn off feelings for someone, even when you know they've been deceiving you. Then she made a critical mistake. She reached out and placed her hand on my thigh, letting it slide upward slightly, and suggested maybe we could discuss this in the bedroom first, try to reconnect physically before making any major decisions. Just like that, the spell was permanently broken. This woman who'd been screaming at me 2 hours earlier, who'd been plotting to use and abandon me, thought she could manipulate me with sex. Like I was so desperate, so controlled by physical desire, that I'd forget everything at the promise of intimacy. I moved her hand away and told her the divorce wasn't negotiable, that she should finish packing and be gone by morning as we'd agreed. Her facade cracked again, all traces of sweetness vanishing. She called me several choice names, said I'd regret this decision, the usual threats. Then she stormed back to the bedroom. They left an hour later. Sarah took more than just her clothes. I noticed a few small valuables missing, like the watch my grandfather had left me and some expensive electronics I'd recently purchased. Petty theft, but not worth fighting over at that point. The apartment felt strangely peaceful once they were gone. I ordered pizza, opened a beer, and watched a movie I'd been wanting to see that Sarah had always vetoed. It was nice, different, but genuinely nice. The tranquility lasted exactly 17 hours. I woke up the next morning to my phone exploding with notifications. Text messages from friends asking if I was okay. Direct messages on social media from people I barely knew asking what had happened. Even an email from my high school girlfriend saying she'd heard about the situation and was available if I needed someone to talk to. Confused, I opened my social media, and there it was. Sarah had gone completely nuclear with a long, dramatic post about how her husband of less than a month had abandoned her, tricked her into marriage under false pretenses, and built what she called a spite house, just to hurt her. She'd included several photographs of my yellow creation, taken from the car when we first arrived, making sure to capture it from the most unflattering angles possible. The comments section was intense. Most of Sarah's friends were sympathetic, calling me every name imaginable. A few seemed skeptical, asking for more details that Sarah was conspicuously avoiding. My mother had entered the discussion defending me until my father apparently convinced her to stop engaging with that nonsense. I closed the app without commenting, let her have her social media moment. I had the truth, the evidence, and most importantly, my freedom. But Sarah wasn't finished. Next came direct text messages to me, alternating between angry demands that I fix the situation by giving her a proper financial settlement and tearful pleas saying she missed me and had made a terrible mistake. I blocked her number. Then she started appearing at my workplace, just happening to be driving by when I was arriving or leaving. Once she brought Jacob along, I assumed to make me jealous. He looked uncomfortable, like he hadn't signed up for this level of drama. I almost felt sorry for him. After a few days of this harassment, I was getting thoroughly tired of the whole situation. My lawyer assured me the divorce would be straightforward and finalized soon since we had no significant assets to divide and no children. But Sarah kept finding ways to delay the process, contesting every minor detail. What really changed everything was when Sarah's friends started reaching out to me privately. At first, I ignored them, assuming they were just going to give me grief on her behalf. But then one of them, a woman named Michelle who'd been Sarah's bridesmaid, sent me a long message saying she'd witnessed the real Sarah and wasn't surprised by what had happened. It turned out Sarah had pulled similar schemes with previous boyfriends. Not the marriage aspect, but the pattern of using men for their money, status, or resources, then discarding them when someone better came along. Michelle had watched it happen multiple times and had finally gotten fed up with Sarah's manipulative games. She offered to provide a statement to my lawyer if needed. Then another friend came forward, and another. Apparently, Sarah had a well-documented history of this behavior that her carefully curated social media presence didn't reveal. Her relationship with Patricia wasn't the loving mother-daughter bond they portrayed publicly. It was more like Patricia was the puppet master and Sarah the willing puppet, executing elaborate schemes together. I didn't want to turn this into some massive public drama, so I simply thanked them for their support and passed their contact information to my lawyer in case we needed character witnesses. But knowing I wasn't the only one who'd been fooled made me feel significantly less stupid about the whole experience. The most surprising contact came from Jacob himself. He reached out through a mutual acquaintance, wanting to meet for a beer. Curious despite myself, I agreed. We met at this dive bar on the edge of town where neither Sarah nor Patricia would be caught dead. He looked nervous, kept checking the door like he expected them to burst in any moment. He wanted me to know he wasn't originally part of their scheme, that Sarah had contacted him after our wedding claiming I was controlling, and she wanted out. He admitted they'd been intimate a couple of times, but swore he didn't know she was planning to use me to secure a house. He said once he figured out what was really happening, he'd cut things off, but Sarah wouldn't stop calling him. Now, he was afraid she'd try to manipulate him the same way she'd manipulated me. I don't know if I believed everything he told me, but he seemed genuinely shaken by the experience. We ended up talking for several hours, comparing notes on Sarah's manipulation tactics. By the end of the evening, we weren't exactly friends, but there was a strange sort of brotherhood in both having dodged the same bullet. As Jacob was leaving, he mentioned something that caught my attention. He said Sarah and Patricia had been telling people they were going to sue me for the yellow house, claiming Sarah had contributed significantly to its design and construction, even though she'd never seen it before that Sunday. I laughed it off at the time, but the next morning I decided it might be worth taking some extra legal precautions. The divorce was finalized about 6 weeks later. Sarah didn't get a penny beyond what she'd brought into the marriage. The Spite House became something of a local legend. People would drive by just to see the infamous yellow monstrosity. Some folks thought it was hilarious, others considered it an eyesore, but everyone had an opinion. Eventually, my crew and I spent a few therapeutic weekends demolishing the Spite House and cleaning up the property. It felt good to tear down something I'd built in anger and pain. I'm thinking of eventually building something real there, the house I'd originally planned, but designed just for me now. Or maybe I'll sell the land when the market improves. No rush to decide. Dating again has been an interesting experience. I was completely upfront about my divorce with the first woman I asked out, expecting it to be a deal breaker, but she was surprisingly understanding. Said her sister had gone through something similar and she knew how challenging trust issues could be. We went out a few times, but didn't really connect romantically. I've been on several first dates since then, nothing serious yet, but it's encouraging to be reminded that not every woman is running some elaborate long-term con. Life has gotten better, significantly better actually. I moved into a small place of my own while figuring out my next steps. Work picked up. My boss gave me more responsibility and a substantial raise after seeing how I'd handled everything with maturity and professionalism. Turns out emotional stability and not being actively defrauded by your spouse makes you considerably more productive. I still have moments where something triggers a memory of Sarah or the whole mess, and I'll feel a flash of anger or sadness. Christopher says that's completely normal, and it'll probably happen less frequently as time passes. He's probably right. 8 months isn't that long in the grand scheme of life. If there's any wisdom to be gained from this experience, I suppose it's the importance of trusting your instincts. I knew something was off from the first time I met Patricia, but I ignored those warning signs because I was so infatuated with Sarah. I overlooked numerous red flags because I wanted so desperately to believe I'd found someone who genuinely cared about me. Next time, if there is a next time, I'll pay closer attention to those subtle warning signs. The way someone treats service staff, how they discuss their ex-partners, whether their actions consistently match their words. All the seemingly small details that add up to reveal who a person truly is beneath the surface they present to the world. I learned that love isn't just about feelings and attraction. It's about respect, honesty, shared values, and genuine partnership. It's about building something together, rather than one person trying to extract value from the other. Sarah and Patricia taught me, in the most painful way possible, the difference between genuine love and skilled manipulation. Looking back, I can see how they gradually conditioned me to accept increasingly unacceptable behavior. The slow erosion of boundaries, the way they made me feel grateful for basic respect, the constant implications that I should consider myself lucky to be with someone like Sarah. Classic manipulation techniques that I simply didn't recognize at the time. The Spite House might have been an extreme reaction, but it served its purpose. It gave me back some sense of control and agency in a situation where I'd felt completely powerless. It showed them that I wasn't the pushover, they thought they'd married. And honestly, it felt good to shock them after months of being the one receiving unpleasant surprises. These days, I'm focused on rebuilding my life on a foundation of authenticity rather than illusion. I'm saving money again, this time for goals that are entirely my own. I've started growing vegetables in my backyard, nothing fancy, just tomatoes and peppers. Christopher's dog visits sometimes, and I'm seriously considering getting one of my own. Simple pleasures that feel profound after all the complexity and deception. I've also been playing basketball on Thursday evenings with some guys from work. Nothing competitive, just a way to stay active and enjoy some uncomplicated male friendship. It's remarkable how good normal, honest interactions feel when you've been living in an atmosphere of constant manipulation and hidden agendas. The legal aftermath took several months to completely resolve. Sarah's attempts to claim any portion of my property or assets were thoroughly rejected by the court. The evidence I'd gathered of their premeditation was overwhelming. Patricia's threats of lawsuits never materialized, probably because any competent lawyer would have told her she had no case and would likely face countersuits for fraud. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Sarah and Patricia had to downsize to a smaller apartment because they couldn't afford their previous lifestyle without my income contributing to their expenses. Sarah had to postpone some professional certification she'd been pursuing because she couldn't qualify for the educational loans. Jacob had apparently been stringing both of them along, never seriously intending to be Sarah's financial backup plan. The house of cards they built around manipulating me had collapsed completely. About 3 months after everything was finalized, I ran into Michelle, Sarah's former bridesmaid, at the grocery store. She told me Sarah was spreading a different version of events to anyone who would listen, claiming I'd psychologically manipulated her and wasted the best years of her life. She conveniently omitted the parts about planning to defraud me and leave me for her ex-boyfriend. Classic Sarah, rewriting history to cast herself as the victim. Michelle also mentioned that Sarah had tried to reconnect with several of her old friends, but most of them had distanced themselves after learning the truth about her pattern of behavior. Apparently, once you're known for manipulating and using people, your social circle tends to shrink pretty rapidly. Patricia had thrown herself into some church group, playing the role of the devoted mother supporting her daughter through a difficult time. I'm sure she was already scouting potential targets for Sarah's next relationship. One evening, about 4 months after the divorce was final, Sarah showed up at my new apartment unannounced. I'm still not sure how she got my address. Fortunately, I wasn't home, but my neighbor told me she'd sat in her car outside for nearly an hour before finally leaving. That was the last time she tried to contact me directly. Sometimes people you've shared your life with become complete strangers, and that's exactly as it should be. The most unexpected development came about 6 months later. I was at the hardware store picking up supplies for a weekend project when I literally collided with someone else's shopping cart. I started apologizing before I even looked up and realized it was Michelle. We'd stayed in touch occasionally since the divorce, but seeing her there felt surreal. She looked embarrassed to run into me, like she was still carrying guilt about her association with Sarah. We ended up getting coffee afterward, and she told me she'd wanted to reach out for months to apologize more formally. She said she'd known some of what Sarah was planning, but not the full extent, and she'd felt horrible about it ever since. We talked for hours that day, and Michelle filled me in on more details about Sarah's past that I'd never known. Apparently, the pattern went back to college, where Sarah had convinced at least 2 different boyfriends to co-sign expensive purchases that she never helped pay for. Patricia had been coaching her daughter in these schemes for years, treating men like natural resources to be extracted and depleted. Michelle and I have become genuine friends since then. She's engaged to a guy who seems completely decent and honest, everything Sarah pretended to be. It's been healing to talk to someone who knew Sarah well and can confirm that I wasn't paranoid or unreasonable. Sometimes you need that external validation that your reality was actually real. Through Michelle, I learned that Sarah eventually did move in with Jacob, but it lasted less than 3 months. Apparently, once he experienced her daily manipulation and Patricia's constant interference firsthand, he understood why I'd built a spite house. The last Michelle heard, Sarah was working at a different dental office and living back with her mother. Some people never learn from their mistakes. They just find new people to make the same mistakes with. I've had time to reflect on the entire experience, and I've come to understand that what happened to me wasn't really about money or houses or even marriage. It was about power and control. Sarah and Patricia got satisfaction from manipulating people, from feeling superior and clever. The financial gain was secondary to the psychological gratification of successfully deceiving someone. That realization helped me let go of a lot of anger I was carrying. I wasn't targeted because there was something wrong with me or because I was particularly gullible. I was targeted because I was kind, trusting, and financially stable. In their minds, those qualities made me an ideal victim. Understanding that helped me preserve those qualities rather than becoming cynical and closed off. I've started dating someone new recently. Her name is Amanda, and she's a teacher at the local elementary school. We met at a community volunteer event, both of us helping to build a playground for kids whose families couldn't afford the fancy equipment. She's genuine in a way that feels almost foreign after Sarah's constant performance. Amanda knows about my divorce and the circumstances around it. I was completely honest with her from our first conversation, and her response was refreshing. She said it sounded like I'd learned some valuable lessons about recognizing manipulation, and that experience would probably make me a more aware partner in the future. No drama, no judgment, just practical wisdom. We've been taking things slowly, which feels right for both of us. She's been married before too, though her situation was different, less dramatic, but equally painful in its own way. We both understand that trust is something you build carefully over time, not something you hand over immediately because someone seems attractive or charming. The land where the Spite House stood is still mine, and I've started making actual plans for it. Not the fantasy house I dreamed of building with Sarah, but something realistic and comfortable designed for the life I'm actually living. Small enough to maintain easily, efficient enough to be affordable, with space for a workshop and maybe a garden. I've learned to appreciate the difference between dreams and plans. Dreams are what I had with Sarah, beautiful fantasies based on hope and imagination rather than reality. Plans are what I'm making now, concrete steps toward achievable goals based on honest assessment of my resources and capabilities. Christopher still jokes about the Spite House whenever we're working on a project together. He says it was the most expensive middle finger in construction history, and he's probably right. But it served its purpose beyond just shocking Sarah and Patricia. It taught me that I could take decisive action when necessary, that I didn't have to accept being victimized passively. My boss recently offered me a partnership in his construction company. He's getting ready to retire in a few years and wants someone he trusts to take over gradually. It's an opportunity I never would have imagined before all this happened. Apparently, the way I handled my personal crisis demonstrated qualities he values in a business partner: strategic thinking, emotional stability under pressure, and the ability to make difficult decisions. I'm seriously considering his offer. It would mean more responsibility and longer hours, but also significantly more income and the chance to build something lasting. The irony isn't lost on me that Sarah's attempts to manipulate my finances might have inadvertently pushed me toward a much more prosperous future than anything she could have provided. Some evenings, when I'm sitting on my small back porch with a beer, watching the sunset and listening to the neighborhood sounds, I feel a deep sense of gratitude for how everything worked out. Not gratitude for the pain or deception, but gratitude for discovering the truth before it was too late, for finding the strength to act decisively, and for learning what genuine peace feels like. I still have moments of sadness about the time I lost, the emotional energy I invested in someone who never valued it properly. But those moments are becoming less frequent and less intense. Mostly, I feel lucky to have escaped with my sanity, my assets, and my capacity for trust intact. The experience taught me that healing isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter. It's about integrating the lessons without letting the damage define you. It's about becoming wiser without becoming bitter, more careful without becoming fearful. If I could go back and give advice to my younger self, the one who was so excited about meeting Sarah at that party 3 years ago, I'd tell him to trust his instincts more and his heart a little less. I'd tell him that when someone's actions don't match their words consistently, believe the actions. I'd tell him that love shouldn't require you to ignore red flags or make excuses for disrespectful behavior. But I wouldn't tell him to avoid taking the risk entirely. The capacity to love and trust deeply is a gift, even when it sometimes leads to pain. The goal isn't to protect yourself so completely that you never get hurt. It's to learn to recognize genuine love when you find it, and to have the courage to walk away when you don't. These days, my life is quieter, but infinitely more authentic. I wake up each morning knowing that the people in my life are there because they choose to be, not because they're planning to extract something from me. My relationships are based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than hidden agendas and elaborate deceptions. The Spite House is gone, demolished and cleared away, but the land remains. Sometimes I drive out there just to walk the property and think about what I want to build next. Not just in terms of architecture, but in terms of life. The foundation is solid now, both literally and metaphorically. Whatever I build on it will be genuine, honest, and entirely my own. That's the real victory in all of this. Not the fact that I exposed Sarah and Patricia's scheme, or that I protected my assets, or even that I built a ridiculous yellow house that became a local legend. The real victory is that I rediscovered who I am when I'm not being manipulated, when I'm not constantly trying to earn love that was never actually available. I'm building a life now that's based on truth rather than illusion, on self-respect rather than the desperate need for approval. And you know what? It's a much better life than anything Sarah and Patricia could have given me, even if their intentions had been genuine. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is having someone show you exactly who they really are. Sarah and Patricia did me that favor, eventually. The Spite House was just my way of returning it.